America has quietly crossed a perilous line that's gone largely unnoticed. The average person is now buried under more than $105,000 of debt. At the same time, the country's own debt is exploding to nearly $38 trillion. This isn't some short-term slump, it's a systemic meltdown trapping families, financial institutions, and the government in a shared nosedive. Month after month, Americans find themselves funneling more money into paying off interest than putting food on the table, saving for tomorrow, or building any kind of financial security. People are defaulting on their loans across the board. The price of everyday life has become unaffordable, and the scariest reality is that there's no easy way to fix this anymore. Worse, the situation is accelerating. The very foundation of the nation's economy is cracking, starting with the finances of ordinary families, and nothing proves this more clearly than that staggering new debt number. That figure, over $105,000 in debt for the typical individual, points to a massive change in how our economy works. People aren't taking out loans to build a better future anymore. They're going into debt simply to survive the present. And this suffocating burden isn't shared equally. It falls hardest on people already squeezed by flat paychecks, rising interest rates, and the runaway cost of essentials like gas and groceries. The end result is a country whose financial health mirrors the same fundamental problems you see in family budgets and on the government's balance sheet, creating a dangerous feedback loop where one crisis makes the other worse. The true weight of that pressure hits home when you see what makes up that $105,000. It isn't just one loan. It's a precarious pile of debt from mortgages, auto loans, credit cards, personal loans, HELOCs, and all those buy now, pay later deals. On average, the monthly bill just to service all this debt has ballooned to over $1,237, which for a typical family is like having another rent or mortgage payment every single month. As interest rates keep rising, that monthly burden just gets bigger, all without improving their lives one bit. Debt has stopped being a cycle and has become a relentless, self-feeding machine. Over the past year alone, family debt levels jumped by 2.4%, pushing the nation's total consumer debt beyond $17.5 trillion. This surge happened while inflation was eating away at everyone's paychecks, meaning people are sinking into debt far quicker than they can ever hope to pay it off, even if they get a raise. This isn't a story about people being irresponsible. It's about an economy where the cost of survival has broken away from what anyone actually earns. That disconnect is precisely what makes this moment in history so dangerous. What's truly terrifying is how fast this debt has gone from a personal problem to a threat to the entire system. Sky-high credit card APRs and constant refinancing have turned household debt into a potential trigger for a full-blown national financial emergency. Mortgage rates remain punishing. Getting a car loan is tougher than ever, and every few months, basic necessities consume an even bigger slice of everyone's income. The result is a country where the typical family isn't moving up the ladder of success anymore. They're stuck in place, unable to move. As we get deeper into this new debt-driven world, the cracks showing in family budgets are starting to perfectly mirror the cracks in the nation's finances. It's putting us on a collision course that will define the next phase of America's economic decline. And when you look closer, the numbers are even more troubling. When you break down that $105,000 number, each type of debt reveals a specific point of failure, and together, they show a financial structure on the verge of collapse. Mortgages make up the largest slice, but the real threat is the explosive growth in every other kind of debt. Mortgage balances are rising, not from a hot housing market, but from existing loans resetting at far higher rates. This has pushed the average mortgage payment so high it's eating up an impossible share of a family's income, with nothing left over. Meanwhile, home equity lines of credit shot up by 7.2% in a single year, exposing a much deeper problem. Families are tapping their home equity at a pace that screams desperation, not smart money management. Using your house as an ATM is the new substitute for getting a raise, and it transforms a family's biggest asset into a final lifeline. The more people trade future security for cash right now, the more fragile the whole system becomes to rate hikes or a drop in property values. Credit card debt is the next major crack in the foundation, with balances growing by 3.12% in just 1 year, while the average interest rate has skyrocketed to between 22 and 28%. That kind of debt multiplies viciously. People aren't using credit for vacations anymore. They're using it to bridge the gap left by inflation. For essentials like food, electricity, and fuel, this creates a trap where your debt grows larger every month from interest alone, even if you don't buy anything new. Then you have auto loans adding another level of financial stress. The average car loan is nearly $25,000 for a depreciating asset, meaning people are deeply underwater on their vehicles almost immediately. Now, shifting gears to the corporate world, when company insiders who know the business best begin dumping their own stock, that's a huge red flag that what they're telling us isn't what's really happening. When they sell, it pulls support out from under the market, the support from the people who are supposed to be the most optimistic. And the final support beam for this entire shaky system is just a story. AI has been hyped as the next big thing, but the stock market has already priced it as if it's flawless, well before it has produced any consistent profits. The second its earnings growth disappoints, even a little, trading bots will dump shares automatically, turning a small dip into a catastrophic crash. This is how a problem at the top sends shockwaves all the way down, linking back to the fundamental flaws that are paving the way for the next crisis. When faith in the stock market vanishes, the pressure will immediately shift to the next weakest link, real estate. As soon as that confidence is gone, the sectors that depend most heavily on borrowing, like housing and commercial property, will be the first to fall. Both are valued at levels so absurdly high they have no chance of surviving in an environment of tighter money. This isn't just a theory anymore. The danger is real. You can see it, and it's getting worse by the day. Right now, house prices are roughly 50% higher than their long-term average, a gap that's even wider than it was at the height of the 2008 housing bubble. We didn't get here by accident. This bubble was inflated by years of rock-bottom interest rates, a severe lack of available homes, and out-of-control speculation. Today, however, a central issue is that nobody can afford to buy. With mortgage rates stuck around 7%, an average family has to earn almost $120,000 annually just to get approved for a home at the median price. That income level is an impossible dream for most Americans, creating a massive gap between what sellers are asking and what buyers can possibly afford. The moment buyers finally walk away, a huge drop in prices is guaranteed, and the situation in commercial real estate is even worse. The shift to working from home has completely shattered the value of office buildings, and with nearly half of all office space sitting empty nationwide at a 45% vacancy rate, it's obvious this isn't just a passing trend. These buildings were bought with loans at about 3% interest, and now more than $2 trillion in commercial loans are due for renewal at today's much higher rates of 7 to 9%. A property that was just scraping by with cheap money has zero chance of making a profit under these new conditions. This isn't just a downturn in the market, it's a mathematical certainty. Owners will be forced to choose between running their buildings at a huge loss or just mailing the keys back to their lender. The economic consequences of this will spread far beyond the property owners. Once the defaults start piling up, the losses get passed straight to the banks holding all that bad debt. When building values have already fallen by 40 to 60%, there's no way for the banks to get a huge chunk of that money back. As they are forced to absorb these massive losses, their cash reserves will quickly drain, and if they dip below what's legally required, the weakness will spread like a virus through the whole financial system. This is exactly how the crisis in commercial real estate infects the rest of the economy and triggers a much bigger collapse. As the housing market comes under more and more stress, its problems are meeting up with the fragility we're already seeing in the stock market. Both of these areas rely entirely on easy access to cheap money, and now that money is getting expensive, their problems started feeding on each other instead of canceling each other out. The implosion of the housing market is just the prelude to the last and most dangerous act of this meltdown, which is the point where the government's own IOUs and the bond market have to soak up all the financial damage the rest of the economy can't take anymore. Every bit of that countrywide risk needs a place to land, and it always ends up in the only place massive enough to absorb it: U.S. Treasury bonds. This is the exact instant the crisis transforms from something bad into something that threatens the entire system. Whenever the stock market and housing began to crumble, big money always ran for cover in the safety of government bonds. But in 2025, that emergency exit is welded shut. Instead of a safe harbor, the bond market is now the powder keg. The country's debt has ballooned beyond $38 trillion, pushing our debt-to-economy ratio to almost 125%, a figure that signals deep financial trouble, not stability. The sheer weight of this mess becomes clear when you see the annual interest bill. Because interest rates are so steep, the government is now forking over more than $1.2 trillion every year just to service the debt it's already racked up. That payment is bigger than our entire military budget and rivals the cost of Social Security. And since the government has to refinance old debt at these new, higher rates, the interest bill just keeps getting bigger, chewing up an ever-growing piece of the nation's wealth while contributing zero to actual economic growth. This is the source of a deep, structural flaw in the system. To make up for the deficit and settle old debts, the Treasury has no choice but to issue a constantly growing mountain of new bonds. The trouble is, nobody's buying. Foreign nations are no longer adding to their piles, and everyday American investors are already tapped out, grappling with their own money problems. It's simple supply and demand. When there's way more supply than demand, bond prices fall and the interest they pay skyrockets. The very thing that was meant to be a release valve for the economy is now fueling a toxic cycle and making the whole situation worse. Those spiking bond yields don't just affect the federal government. They slam regular people. That's what's driving up the rates on your mortgage, business loans, car notes, and credit card balances. The exact financial stress that first destabilized the housing sector and company balance sheets is now being amplified as borrowing costs go through the roof for everyone. The whole economy is approaching a breaking point, where the massive expense of its own debt is simply too much for the country to handle. If bond rates jump too quickly, the government gets cornered with nothing but awful choices. Make devastating cuts to spending, raise taxes to crushing levels, or just print currency to cover its expenses. Each of those paths leads to a different flavor of financial catastrophe. Slashing spending would trigger a severe recession, jacking up taxes would smother any new investment, and firing up the printing presses would risk a complete collapse of the dollar. And not a single one of them solves the fundamental issue. The market is flooded with far too many government bonds. Now that the traditional safe haven is gone, all that financial stress needs a new outlet. That's the trigger for the next chapter of this disaster. And if you look at the past, it's clear our current financial setup is even more brittle than the ones that have collapsed before. It also explains why things are about to get incredibly dangerous, incredibly quickly, now that the government's own credit is being questioned. The lessons from the past are screaming at us. What's happening in 2025 isn't new. It's a souped-up repeat of the very circumstances that sparked the two worst financial collapses in recent memory. The truly scary part this time around isn't how much it looks like the past, it's the unbelievable size of it all. Every single danger signal is blinking more intensely than we've ever seen. If you go back to 1929, the market's main measure of value, the P/E ratio, peaked at about 33, which was considered insane at the time. In 2025, we are right around that same level, but the danger is much greater now because a huge amount of money is concentrated in just a handful of giant corporations, which makes the entire structure way more rickety than it was back in the day. The speculative mania of 1929 was built around revolutionary tech like the automobile and the power grid. Right now, our whole financial world is gambling on a single narrative: artificial intelligence. Company values have been inflated to absurd heights well before they've generated any significant profits. The way the market is set up looks a lot like the late 1920s, but the intensity is much, much higher. And when you examine the debt situation, you find chilling similarities to 2000 and 2008. Before the Great Recession hit, the main threats were consumer debt and a completely out-of-control mortgage industry, plus all the complicated financial instruments that amplified that danger. The difference is, that problem was largely isolated to the housing market and assets tied to mortgages. 2025 is another animal altogether. This time, you got mountains of debt stacked up in nearly every part of the economy. Credit card balances are past $1.1 trillion. Businesses owe more than $10 trillion, and student debt is nearing $1.77 trillion. And to top it all off, the derivatives market represents an unbelievable $600 trillion in theoretical value. Never in history have we seen a potential collapse developing across so many fronts at once. But what really makes 2025 worse than both 1929 and 2008 is how shaky the U.S. government's own finances are. Back in the Great Depression, the national debt was low, which let the government spend huge amounts of money to get the economy back on its feet. In 2008, our debt was only about 67% of our total economy, giving the Treasury and the Federal Reserve plenty of runway to roll out massive, multi-trillion-dollar rescue packages without panicking investors. But today, in 2025, with our debt at $38 trillion and nearly 125% of our GDP, that safety net has been completely shredded. The same government that was once the foundation of financial stability is now one of the biggest risks in the game. These historical red flags aren't appearing one by one. They're all smashing together with the fundamental weaknesses baked into our current financial world and paving the way for the next terrifying phase. And in this phase, for the first time in its history, the Federal Reserve is going into a crisis with no real weapons left to fight it, with nothing in its arsenal powerful enough to prevent a total breakdown. A review of the past points to a bleak reality. Every other crisis was ultimately brought under control because the Fed had choices. In 1929, it could flood the economy with credit. In 2008, it had the power to slash interest rates from 5.25% down to nothing and launch enormous money creation campaigns. But in 2025, those emergency measures are off the table. The entire financial world is now floating into a new stage of this crisis, with its main bank completely boxed in, powerless to rescue a collapsing market without triggering a different kind of catastrophe. The first major constraint is interest rates. They were jacked up to combat inflation, and slashing them now would invite a return of the out-of-control price increases that were nearing 9% just a couple of years back. The Fed is in a position where it can't make any significant cuts to rates without shattering its own reputation and starting a whole new wave of inflation. Yet holding rates this high creates unbearable strain on mortgages, company loans, credit card debt, and even the government's own borrowing. The only entity that has always been able to calm the waters is now caught in a lose-lose situation, where any move it makes only deepens the crisis. The next big problem is the Fed's own financial statement. Following years of creating money to purchase bonds, the Fed is holding more than $7 trillion worth of assets. If it were to restart that program on a large scale, it would confirm the bond market's worst fears that the U.S. government is out of real money to pay its debts and is being forced to fire up the printing presses. The moment investors perceive this new money printing as a desperate government rescue rather than a legitimate economic strategy, confidence in American debt will evaporate, sending bond yields soaring even higher. The very instrument that once soothed rattled markets now risks igniting a full-blown panic. The last piece of this puzzle is political. The American people have already endured years of painful inflation, which was partially driven by these exact policies. Attempting to run the same plays in a fresh crisis would unleash a furious public outcry, create total gridlock in the government, and might even lead to new legislation designed to take away the Fed's authority. A central bank is effectively neutered if it's politically shackled, unable to make a move. The very legitimacy of its power to step in is now being challenged, which restricts both the scale and speed of its response. And all these limitations are converging at the worst possible moment. Markets desperate for a cash injection can no longer hope for a swift bailout. Entire sectors that were built on the back of cheap borrowing can't assume they'll be able to refinance. And the government itself has lost its ability to use the Fed to mask its out-of-control spending. This leaves the entire economy exposed and defenseless as the next phase of the meltdown kicks off. Attention is now turning away from the system's general flaws and toward the immediate damage being done to the banks carrying the greatest exposure. Since the Federal Reserve is effectively out of the picture, the full burden of the crisis lands directly on the banks, and the first cracks are already showing. The most immediate and glaring area of stress is commercial real estate. The core of the issue is that banks are heavily exposed to the massive loans that underpin commercial real estate like office buildings, malls, hotels, and warehouses. Across major cities, where empty space now exceeds 40%, the stream of rent that once covered those mortgage payments has all but vanished. And with more than $2 trillion in these loans about to come due, they will have to be refinanced at interest rates that are double or triple what they were, and the fundamental arithmetic completely breaks down. A building that was profitable on a 3% mortgage becomes an immediate money loser with a new 7 to 9% loan, unless its rental income explodes, which isn't happening. So when property owners can't cover the new, inflated payments, they're just handing the keys back. The banks are then stuck with properties worth only 60% of the original loan amount. These are not minor write-downs. They are the kinds of catastrophic events that can completely evaporate a bank's capital. A smaller regional bank, with just a few $1 billion of assets, could have its entire financial base wiped out by a single bad loan portfolio. The danger from these failing business loans is magnified because the risk is concentrated in smaller, regional banks, which are significantly more vulnerable than the enormous, globally recognized financial titans. We've already witnessed the initial casualties in Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic. They collapsed before the economy had even officially tipped into a recession, acting as a clear warning shot, not some bizarre anomaly. Dozens of other banks are operating with the same underlying vulnerabilities, as they failed to build up adequate capital cushions during the long period of cheap credit. Once losses begin to eat away at a bank's capital, public confidence is the only asset that truly counts. People don't stick around waiting for a press conference. The faintest whisper of trouble is enough to start a stampede to withdraw funds. The hard truth is that even a perfectly solvent bank doesn't keep enough physical cash on hand to survive a sudden, overwhelming wave of withdrawals. Our financial system is designed around fractional reserves, which means no bank is structurally built to withstand a full-blown bank run. This is where the FDIC is supposed to be the safety net, but the figures reveal just how dangerously under-resourced it is. The entire insurance fund holds about $125 billion, while it is tasked with insuring over $10 trillion in deposits nationwide. It would only require the collapse of a few medium-sized banks to completely drain that fund. If a series of failures were to happen in rapid succession, the math just wouldn't work. The fund would be insolvent. At that stage, the last resort is a federal bailout, but the government's own financial house is in disarray, with a national debt standing at $38 trillion and rapidly rising interest costs. This powerlessness to act as a backstop in a widespread crisis leaves the entire financial system balanced on a knife's edge, creating a high-pressure environment where both consumers and businesses are being forced to alter their behavior. As banks continue to absorb these mounting losses, that financial strain gets passed directly down to ordinary households, exposing a deep-seated fragility in consumer finances that was masked by years of easy credit. The typical American is just not equipped to handle a major financial shock. You can see the evidence across every category of consumer debt, where total balances and late payments have surged to alarming new highs. Credit card balances have swollen to more than $1.1 trillion, a figure higher than any point in history. With interest rates now climbing past 21%, what was once a tool for convenience has become a long-term debt cycle. Because wages have failed to keep pace with the cost of living, millions are now forced to rely on credit cards simply to pay for essentials. We are not talking about discretionary purchases. When debt grows this quickly, the ability to repay it disappears just as fast. The percentage of accounts more than 90 days delinquent has now reached a level not seen since the aftermath of the last great financial meltdown. This is not an issue of a few people facing hardship. It is a clear sign of systemic financial distress. The auto loan market tells the very same story. The average monthly payment now exceeds $740, and loans are often extended over 84 months. These types of long-term payment plans leave zero margin for financial error. At present, roughly 7.5% of all car loans are over 90 days past due, a definitive warning of systemic weakness as auto repossessions begin to rise. When people lose their transportation, they often lose their ability to maintain employment, which only worsens their financial plight and quickens their descent. On top of this, student loans add another heavy layer of pressure, with the outstanding balance approaching $1.77 trillion. Now that these loan repayments have resumed, billions of dollars in disposable income are being drained from households every single month. This squeeze is most severe for younger workers, who are already contending with sky-high housing costs and possess little to no savings. A substantial portion of their income is now being diverted to service a debt that provides them no immediate tangible value. This cripples the purchasing power of the very demographic that is supposed to be the engine of economic growth. As the financial health of individuals becomes more precarious, the job market begins to reflect that instability. Businesses dealing with flagging demand and higher credit costs begin to trim their workforces. The rise in unemployment from 3.4% to above 4% is not a minor statistical adjustment. It is a clear indicator that the formerly strong labor market is beginning to come apart. There is a leading economic indicator known as the SAM rule, which flags an oncoming recession when the unemployment rate rises by half a percentage point above its recent low. We are currently teetering on the verge of hitting that very trigger. Once widespread layoffs truly begin, job losses will ripple from one sector to the next, which in turn will cause consumer spending to contract even more sharply. It all converges into a self-reinforcing downturn. Families fall behind on their debts, businesses watch their revenues evaporate, and additional layoffs mean less income circulating in the economy. Each issue worsens the others, trapping the economy in a downward spiral as consumer fragility spreads. The problems in the financial system then metastasize from being a contained banking issue into a full-scale economic decay, setting the stage for the most destructive chain reaction in generations. When you have households under pressure, corporations stretched thin, and banks on shaky ground all at the same time, the entire system becomes exceptionally brittle and vulnerable to the smallest shock. A crash of this magnitude doesn't begin with a single, spectacular explosion. It begins when an already compromised system is hit with one more stressor that it cannot withstand. The tipping point could be something as seemingly insignificant as a major tech firm reporting weak earnings. It could be a regional lender announcing surprise losses, a failed government bond auction, or a new international crisis. The specific catalyst is almost irrelevant. What is crucial is that the foundation is already compromised. The instant a major sell-off begins, high-frequency trading algorithms will activate and accelerate the decline. A single piece of negative news from one of the Magnificent Seven stocks, which represent nearly 30% of the S&P 500's market capitalization, has the capability to erase trillions of dollars in market wealth in just a few days. Every point of decline from these corporate giants is amplified across innumerable index funds. This affects everything from individual retirement accounts to large institutional portfolios. As prices fall rapidly, it triggers a wave of margin calls. Investors who bought on credit are forced to provide more capital, and when they can't, their positions are liquidated, driving the market down even faster. Forced selling triggers more panic selling, sending prices downward with the same terrifying speed seen in every major financial collapse in history, and at the same time, the bond markets begin to fracture. Typically, when equities fall, investors seek refuge in the safety of government bonds. But with a $38 trillion national debt and rising rates, that safe harbor is no longer guaranteed. If bond prices collapse alongside stocks, the system loses its ultimate line of defense. Surging bond yields push up mortgage rates, corporate borrowing costs, and consumer credit card APRs even further. Liquidity and credit evaporate from the entire system all at once. At that moment, the housing market seizes up completely. Potential buyers disappear, sellers hold firm on their prices, and the number of sales transactions plummets. As home values begin to fall, millions of homeowners will find they are underwater, owing more than their properties are worth. The outlook for commercial real estate is even grimmer. Property owners who cannot refinance their buildings at the new 7 to 9% interest rates will inevitably default, offloading yet another wave of toxic loans onto the very banks that are already on the ropes. These new losses will decimate bank capital and suffocate their capacity to lend. When banks shut off the flow of credit, businesses can no longer obtain the cash needed for operations, forcing them to begin laying off employees. Unemployment will skyrocket as the job cuts spread from the technology sector into retail, manufacturing, shipping, and finance. A move from 4% to 7 or even 10% unemployment is economically devastating. It would pull hundreds of billions of dollars of consumer spending out of the economy. Less spending leads directly to lower corporate profits, which sends the stock market into an even deeper tailspin. City and state budgets will start to disintegrate as tax revenues vanish. This will force local governments to slash essential services, which only intensifies the economic pain for everyone. What follows is not a standard recession. It is a fundamental reordering of the economy. Retirement portfolios could plummet by 60 to 70%, wiping out a lifetime of savings and forcing millions to remain in the workforce indefinitely. A housing market collapse will leave countless people financially shackled to homes they can't sell. Meanwhile, the next generation of graduates will enter a bleak job landscape with few openings and lower salaries, crippling their financial futures from the start. A wave of bankruptcies will hit small businesses as credit dries up, making loans impossible to secure. Seizing the opportunity, massive corporations will swallow up their struggling rivals, crushing competition and stifling innovation. Social support systems will buckle under the strain of overwhelming demand. At the same time, shrinking tax revenues will force deep cuts to the social safety net precisely when people are most desperate for help. A rebound could be years away, and that's only if the government has any economic tools left. If not, the recovery could take a generation. This is the endgame of the coming crash. It's far more than just a dip in the stock market. It represents a profound restructuring of economic life in America, one that will fundamentally alter what wealth, opportunity, and stability mean for an entire generation.